Welcome to Part 2 of the Industrial Revolution screencast. Part 1 provided an overview of industrialization in Great Britain. We will now discuss its spread across the world as well as its social impact. Let's start by briefly reviewing industrialization's origins in Great Britain. It started with the invention of the flying shuttle for hand looms in homes. Then with wider fabric, it was faster weaving, but there was more yarn needed. So James Hargreaves' spinning jenny helped address that. Again, it was for home use, so not yet in a factory. That produced more yarn. Faster weaving was needed now. So now we turn to Edmund Cartwright's water-powered loom. Now this was the shift to factory use away from the cottage industries. Then James Watts improved the steam engine, again for factory use. And then British cloth production, as a result, increased. The cotton cloth became Britain's most valuable product, which is one of the reasons why British merchants were able to make so much money. British cotton was then sold throughout the world. Now, the main idea for the spread of the Industrial Revolution was the fact that government funding was so important. For instance, without government funding, much of the infrastructure needed to industrialize the economy would have never existed. Okay, so government policy was very important. Governments in Belgium, France, and the German states supported industrialization and provided funds to build roads, canals, and railroads. These transportation systems were needed to help move goods across different nations and also across continents. When the Industrial Revolution spread to the United States, thousands of miles of roads and canals were also built to help link the East Coast and the West. In 1807, Robert Fulton built the first paddle-wheel steamboat, improving transportation on the waterways. However, railroads ended up becoming much more effective in transporting goods from one place to another. As farmers and immigrants filled the cities, a labor force became available to the factory owners. Women and children, who were paid much lower wages, were often the workers in these factories. It wasn't until much later that they made child labor laws. Some owners actually hired entire families, including children of all ages, to come work in the factories. Next, turn to the social impact of Europe. Industrialization urbanized Europe and created new social classes, as well as the conditions for the rise of socialism. This period witnessed the emergence of the industrial working class and the industrial middle class. European cities and towns grew dramatically by 1850. In fact, it grew from a population of 140 million in 1750 to over 266 million by 1850. The rapid growth of cities led to overcrowding, disease, and poverty. A lot of the disease was caused because there was just a lack of sanitation and sewer systems in the cities at the time, and they really weren't fully developed until the early 1900s. Industrial capitalism rose during the Industrial Revolution and produced a new middle class that built the factories, bought the machinery, and developed the markets. The Industrial Revolution also led to the development of an industrial working class. For example, some of the working class people had little protection from factory and mine owners and faced dangerous working conditions. In the coal mines, a lot of them faced cave-ins, explosions, and poisonous gas fumes that eventually destroyed their lungs. On the right, we can see some children who were actually working in coal mines at the time. Women and children also made up a significant portion of the labor force, primarily because they were cheaper to hire. They too faced dangerous working conditions in the factories, a lot of times working 14-hour shifts with little or no breaks and stifling heat. So let's briefly review some of the social changes that occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Before the Revolution, agricultural work on farms and in homes predominated, and the cottage industry was really what the economy was. Most people lived in rural areas. For instance, in America, around the time of the founding, over 90% of the population were actually farmers. Single workers or families produced the product. Okay, so whatever they used, they usually made themselves. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of this changed. Manufacturing predominated. Workers were in factories instead of as much farming, and the cottage industry really disappeared. Workers moved to cities. Populations exploded across Europe and America, but that also created a lot of overcrowding and poor conditions that led to disease. Factories practiced the division of labor, meaning people had specific tasks that they did over and over again. A lot of times they were repetitive and boring. The factory work required longer hours. A lot of times they would try to keep these going 24 hours a day with very bad working conditions. And child labor occurred on a large scale. Again, there were very few child labor laws at the time, and women and children were paid much lower wages. Now, because of this, a lot of reformers came along proposing different ways to run the economy or to run society. Reformers of these harsh working conditions advocated what was called socialism. They thought that instead of having private industry, there should be public ownership of production, and that wealth would be more evenly distributed because of this. A lot of economic systems that adopted this model, what happened was usually the government would own the means of production. They would own the factories and utilities and then divvy up the resources how they saw fit. The picture to the right is of utopian socialist Robert Owen. He thought that an ideal society could be created through this idea of socialism. Now, as we move on in the course, we're going to see that in the 20th century, a lot of the nations that adopt communism, a lot of these communist regimes look back to these people like Owen and Karl Marx as the foundation of their thought process and how society should be created. We now turn to some of the causes and effects regarding the Industrial Revolution. Some of the causes, there's a population growth, exploitation of natural resources, along with technological advances. Now, some effects of the industrialization would be use of new power sources, invention of new technologies, the search for new additional raw materials and markets, which was intertwined with colonization and colonialism, a rise of a middle class, the birth of big business, the growth of cities, and also the development of new philosophies, one of which I just mentioned with socialism and communism. Now, to finish up, let's review some of the ways that the Industrial Revolution transformed society. First, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain and spread throughout Europe and the United States. New technologies improved the production and transportation of goods. Workers migrated to cities as economies shifted from being farm-based to factory-based. And as cities grew, an industrial middle class and an industrial working class emerged. This concludes the Industrial Revolution screencast. Have a great day.